welcome to another episode of Uncle Court, the internet's only advice show where we argue with your uncles so you don't have to. I'm Dr. D, resident uncle, and as always I'm joined by my wonderful friend and legal advisor, Mr. Sparkles. So, without any further ado, let's jump right into it. Our question today comes all the way from Columbus, Ohio, and it reads, Dear Uncle Court, after Thanksgiving dinner this year, my uncle decided to drink 3 rum and eggnogs and then insisted on sharing his views on the immigrant caravan we've heard so much about in the news lately. He then told my cousin and I that the immigrants deserved their treatment because they were criminals for trying to enter the country illegally, and that they should have entered the legal way rather than cutting to the front of the line. When we told him that they were seeking asylum, he countered by saying that it's not our country's responsibility to take care of these people just because their own countries couldn't. This doesn't really sound right to me, but I don't really know how to respond. Uncle Court, is my uncle right? Well, dear listener, there certainly is a lot to unpack there, but I think we can handle it. Alright, so the first parade we've got to rain on here is the idea that undocumented immigrants aren't immigrating the right way. Unfortunately, as of now, there are only 4 ways to legally immigrate to the United States as a permanent resident. They are as follows. 1. Having a direct relative who is already a citizen or green card holder. This individual can petition for you to get a visa, but approval is not guaranteed and certain relationships are given higher preference. 2. Securing employment from a U.S. company. Unfortunately, these visas are only given out to individuals with specialized skill sets in high-demand fields. Unfortunately for many immigrants, this option is off the table given its strict requirements. 3. By seeking asylum and qualifying as a refugee. In order to qualify as a refugee, you must demonstrate to the U.S. government that you're unable to return to your home country due to a well-founded fear of persecution. Unfortunately, under our current political administration, the definition of a well-founded fear is now more narrow than ever. The last way to gain citizenship is through the Diversity Visa Lottery Program. These visas are limited to 50,000 individuals annually, with preference given to countries with low numbers of immigrants in the past 5 years. So unfortunately, holding out for a lottery spot is often impossible for individuals whose circumstances demand immediate action. So, as you can see, legal means of entering the country aren't always an option for immigrants. It does provide us a pretty good segue for addressing your "they're not our country's problem" sentiment, though. Despite our current administration's convenient amnesia, these immigrants are very much our country's problem. That's to say, we've got a pretty rich history here in the United States of dipping down into Central America, taking what we want, and then kind of just leaving without picking up the pieces. Sadly, I have neither the time nor the whiteboard markers to document each intervention and its subsequent consequences, so instead, we'll look at the 2 countries whose experience are indicative of the problem as a whole, Honduras and Guatemala. Alright, so our story begins all the way back in 1823 with the signing of our old friend the Monroe Doctrine. Now, if you don't remember, the doctrine designates all of North and South America as part of the United States' sphere of influence. It permits the U.S. military to intervene across both continents, no questions asked. You smart campers out there will remember that this is the BS permission slip that President Polk used to start the Mexican-American War in 1846. Now, let's fast forward just a bit to the turn of the 20th century, where one of my personal favorite inventions was just making its debut. That's right, the refrigerator. Now, refrigerators are cool and all, but it's their capacity to keep foods fresh for prolonged periods of time that really sets this story in motion. So around this time, American venture capitalists, namely Minor Keith and Sam Zemurray, realized they had an untapped market on their hands. That is, up until then, most Americans had never had a banana. And now, thanks to the miracle of refrigeration, the United States was on the cusp of its latest craze. Being the illustrious men they were, Keith and Zemurray decided to start their own fruit companies, the United Fruit Company and the Cuyamel Fruit Company respectively. Now, until this point, the majority of fruit production was dispersed among smaller plantations with no real need for large companies. This, of course, would all change with the arrival of American business interests. Before they knew it, Keith and Zemurray were making obscene amounts of money in the fruit business. At its founding, the United Fruit Company was capitalized at $11,230,000, or about $336 million when accounting for inflation. The United Fruit Company would go on to become the largest employer in all of Central America by 1930. These dudes were so rich, in fact, that they surpassed the economic capabilities of the countries they were doing business in, even offering to pay off national debts. This significantly shifted negotiation power in their favor. Recognizing this leverage, Cuyamel and United turned their attention to their influencing the political sphere. Upset by Honduran President Miguel Davila's decision to grant a railroad concession to his competitors, the Vaccaro brothers, in 1910 Samuel Zemurray did what any reasonable person would do and staged a coup to overthrow the entire Honduran government. It took him 6 weeks. Now, much chummier with the government, Zemurray would go on to partner with new President Manuel Bonilla. In exchange for access and control to Honduras' natural resources, as well as other tax and financial incentives, President Bonilla in turn would receive cooperation, protection, and substantial amount of U.S. capital to build a progressive infrastructure in Honduras. Not only did this give Zemurray control over Honduras' chief export, he now had investments in every other major industry. This tactic of business by force would set the stage for U.S. fruit companies' behavior in Central America throughout the 20th century. Names and places would change, but the story is almost always the same. U.S.-backed puppet governments supplying corrupt American companies with tax breaks and land grants in exchange for modern infrastructure and other payoffs for a wealthy minority. Thus, the term Banana Republic is born. So, what does this all have to do with your drunk uncle? Chill out, dude, I'm getting there. Now, where were we? Oh yeah, so because land ownership was so tightly controlled, Central American citizens were forced to accept inhumane working conditions, unfair pay, and a rapidly expanding wage gap between themselves and rich bureaucrats. These conditions would subsist throughout the 20th century, with labor strikes typically ending in violence or with few concessions made on behalf of fruit companies. This left citizens with few opportunities to seek out better lives on their own accord. Towards the middle of the 20th century, the United States was heavily invested in the United Fruit Company, which at this point was the only major fruit contender left and supplied 90% of United States bananas. Any attempts to disrupt this relationship were met with swift intervention on behalf of the government. Most notoriously, in 1954, when a CIA-backed coup exiled Guatemala's democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz. His crime? Proposing to redistribute unused land to peasants and ensure more humane working conditions for fruit laborers. He was framed as a communist, chased into exile, and quickly replaced by a vicious far-right dictatorship, all at the hands of our own government. Opposition to this new regime and the subsequent military dictatorships that followed led to a 36-year-long civil war between 1960 and 1996 in Guatemala. That's right, 36 years. This civil war would go on to claim the lives of over 200,000 individuals, with an estimated 83% being indigenous peoples living in rural areas. All while our own Central Intelligence Agency provided intelligence, training, and armed support to the Guatemalan government, all in the name of fighting communism. To paint an even grimmer picture, this was only one of the multiple civil wars fought in Central America at the time. In the 1980s, President Reagan armed, trained, and supported death squads in El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua as well, all while mongering fear among American people that another communist state like Libya or Cuba was right at their doorstep. So confused about caravans. To return to your uncle's not our problem sentiment, unfortunately, this very much is our problem. The United States government has played a direct role in holding Central America's economy hostage for the better part of a century. It's escalated a series of local political conflicts into full-blown civil wars, created unprecedented social and economic breakdown, and ultimately has displaced hundreds of thousands of individuals. It's no surprise that drug trafficking and gang violence have plagued these countries facing such insurmountable systemic barriers. Rather than use these problems as an excuse to keep immigrants out and scale back aid to Latin America, I think we owe it to these nations to recognize our part in creating these conditions. We've ignored the problem for too long, and now it's knocking at our door. I think it's time to pay the piper. Well, I think that's about all we've got time for today, folks. I hope you learned something. And I'm your host, Dr. D. This is Mr. Sparkles, and we've had a wonderful time and hope to see you next episode. Oh, and don't forget, never trust anybody invoking the Monroe Doctrine.